2 summers ago, Eric and I decided to escape the chaos of city life with a weekend camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It seemed like the perfect getaway, isolated, serene, and hours from the nearest sign of civilization. The forest enveloped us in its vast silence, a peaceful contrast to the constant hum of city noise. The first day was perfect. We hiked to a remote clearing, set up our tent, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows under a blanket of stars. But as night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I brushed it off as nerves. Eric was unbothered, laughing at my unease as we crawled into the tent for the night. But around midnight, I was jolted awake by his urgent whisper. "Sarah, look," he said, pointing toward the thin mesh of the tent. In the distance, through the dense line of trees, a faint glow flickered. It wasn't the sharp beam of a flashlight. It looked more like an old-fashioned lantern, swaying gently as if carried by someone. I felt a chill run through me. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. Eric tried to reassure me. "Probably another camper. Nothing to worry about." But the way his voice wavered told me he didn't believe it either. The lantern light stayed in the same spot for hours, just hovering in the trees, and neither of us could sleep. By morning, it was gone. Eric joked that we'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. That day, we tried to enjoy ourselves, but the forest felt different, watchful, as though unseen eyes were following our every move. Every crack of a branch made me jump, and even Eric seemed on edge. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. Every sound amplified in the stillness. Around 2 a.m., a scraping noise pulled me from a restless sleep. It was faint at first, like something dragging along the outside of the tent. My heart pounded as the sound grew louder, circling us. Eric grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. "There's nothing there," he whispered, but his hand was trembling. Then I saw it, the lantern light again, only this time it was much closer, bobbing just beyond the trees. My stomach churned with dread. "We need to leave," I whispered. Eric hesitated, but nodded. We scrambled to pack our gear, the sounds outside growing louder as if something or someone was moving closer. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bags into my pack. And then we heard it, a low, raspy voice drifting from the trees, leaving so soon. I frowned. The voice was calm, almost amused, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Eric grabbed my arm, and we bolted. We left half our gear behind, running blindly through the dark forest, with only the weak beam of his flashlight to guide us. The lantern light followed, flickering between the trees, always just behind us. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we reached the dirt path that led back to the car. The light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and the forest returned to its unnatural silence. We didn't stop until we were safely in the car, speeding down the mountain road. Neither of us spoke the entire drive home, the voice still echoing in my mind. A week later, Eric decided to report what happened to the park rangers. They listened patiently, but looked skeptical. "You're not the first to mention strange lights in that area," one ranger admitted, "but we've never found anything out there." To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. Was it a person? Something else? I've replayed that weekend over and over in my mind, searching for answers. But the only thing I'm certain of is this: I'll never go camping again. It was sophomore year in college when my friends and I, Mark, Ethan, and Jake, decided to take a camping trip to break away from the monotony of campus life. We chose a remote site in a state park in Oregon, miles from the nearest town. Jake had heard about it online, calling it secluded paradise. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We pitched our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with chirping crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. By the time we settled around the campfire that night, we felt completely detached from the world. We stayed up late, swapping ghost stories and laughing about who would be the first to run if something spooky actually happened. Around midnight, the fire began to die down, and we started to call it a night. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Another camper, Ethan asked, glancing into the darkness. "Out here?" "Doubt it," Mark replied. Jake, ever the joker, shone his flashlight into the trees. "Hello, wanna join us for s'mores?" No answer. The footsteps paused, then resumed, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't care to be seen, but wanted us to know they were there. We tried to laugh it off. Nervous laughter. "Really?" Mark suggested it might be a deer, but these were human steps, the steady, deliberate crunch of boots pressing into the forest floor. For the next hour, the sound circled our campsite. We shouted into the trees, but no one responded. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance. Relieved, we doused the fire and crawled into our tents. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart pounded as I Saturday up, straining to hear. The sound was coming from near the fire pit. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat. A man stood by the dying embers of our fire, his figure barely illuminated by the faint orange glow. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and he wore a hood that shadowed most of his face. He wasn't holding camping gear or anything that suggested he belonged out here. He just stood there, staring into the ashes. I whispered to Mark, who was in the tent next to mine. "Someone's out there." Mark scrambled out quietly, holding a flashlight. Ethan and Jake joined us, armed with a hatchet and a stick. Jake tried to laugh it off. Just some weirdo stealing our snacks. But it wasn't just the cooler. We found faint boot prints circling our tents, so close that whoever it was must have been watching us while we slept. Despite the eerie discovery, we decided to stay one more night. None of us wanted to admit we were scared. We spent the day hiking, but the forest felt different, quieter, as if the usual sounds of nature had retreated. That evening, we rebuilt the fire and stayed close to it, nervously chatting to fill the silence. By midnight, the tension was unbearable. We decided to take turns keeping watch, each of us armed with whatever we could find. Around 2 a.m., during Mark's watch, I woke to the sound of him shouting, "Get up, he's back." We scrambled out of our tents to see the man standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. This time, he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the trees, their features just as obscured, their clothes just as dirty. "Stay back," Jake yelled, waving the hatchet. The figures didn't move. They stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for something. Panic set in. Without a word, we grabbed our packs and bolted, leaving the tents and whatever gear we couldn't carry. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, panting and drenched in sweat. When we finally drove away, I looked back toward the trailhead. In the rear-view mirror, I thought I saw the faint glow of a fire in the distance. We never reported it, and I don't know who or what we encountered that night. But I'll never forget the way they stood there watching, as if we were the intruders in their world. Last year, my husband, James and I decided to escape our busy city lives and reconnect with nature. We drove deep into a remote part of a national forest in Colorado, choosing a spot miles away from the designated camping areas. It felt wild and untouched, exactly what we were looking for. The first day was beautiful. We set up our tent in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and spent the afternoon exploring the trails. By evening, the air turned crisp and we lit a small campfire. As we sat there eating s'mores, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Do you ever get the sense someone's watching you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. James laughed. "Out here, it's probably just a deer or something. Relax." I forced a smile, but kept glancing over my shoulder at the encroaching darkness. The firelight barely illuminated the forest beyond, and every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, as we were about to call it a night, we heard the sound of a twig snapping. It was sharp and deliberate, like someone stepping just beyond the edge of the clearing. James grabbed his flashlight and pointed it into the trees. "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. He swung the beam in a slow arc, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A pale face, barely visible between the trees, watching us. My stomach turned, but before I could say anything, the light moved, and the face was gone. "I didn't see anything," James said, though his voice was tight. We decided to head to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. Sometime in the early hours, I woke to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, encircling our tent. My heart pounded as I shook James awake. "Listen," I whispered. He frowned, his hand reaching for the camping knife he kept by his side. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a hand pressed against the fabric of the tent. Right where my head was, I screamed, and James lunged for the zipper, yanking it open. He jumped out, knife in hand, and shone the flashlight around. There was no one there. "Whoever you are, stay the hell away from us," he shouted into the dark. The only response was the wind rustling through the trees. We didn't sleep after that. We stayed by the fire until the first light of dawn, huddled close and listening for any sound. When the sun finally rose, we began packing up to leave. That's when I noticed the handprints. On the back of our tent, pressed into the fabric, were two distinct muddy prints. They were larger than mine, but not quite James's size. They looked human. "James," I called, my voice trembling. He came over and frowned when he saw them, relieving now. We grabbed what we could and hiked back to the car, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. When we reached the car, relief washed over me. But as we pulled out onto the gravel road, I glanced back toward the trailhead. Standing just at the edge of the forest was a figure. It was the same pale face I'd seen the night before, its expression blank and emotionless. "Drive faster," I whispered, my voice shaking. James didn't ask questions. He hit the gas. We never reported what happened. What could we even say? That someone or something had been watching us in the woods. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or who left those handprints, but we haven't been camping since. And every time I see a picture of a forest, I feel a chill run down my spine. Some places aren't meant to be explored.